I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Last week, Tom Friedman wrote a column in the Times headlined, "Trump's Big Lie Devoured the GOP and Now Eyes Our Democracy." He wrote, quote, "The more one GOP lawmaker after another signs on to Trump's big lie, the more it gives the party license on the state level to promote voter suppression laws that ensure it cannot ever lose again." Just in the last week or so, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a voter restriction bill that limits ballot drop boxes and expands ID requirements for absentee ballots. He signed the bill live on Fox News. Fox was the only media allowed at the event. Texas is moving closer to enacting even tougher voting restrictions. And Arizona is in the midst of a wacky election recount that state officials say is riddled with flaws. They're actually trying to find traces of bamboo on 40,000 ballots, based on the conspiracy theory that those ballots were flown in from Asia. Seriously. Has the Republican Party declared war on democracy based on the big lie that the election was stolen? Have they decided that with America's changing demographics, with more and more Black and brown citizens, their only path to national and local victories is voter suppression? We're joined by Trip Gabriel, a national correspondent for the Times, and Matt Flegenheimer, a national political correspondent for the Times. We're talking after House Republicans purged Representative Liz Cheney. Now, Liz Cheney said that by doing so, they were emboldening a liar. Does this make her a heroine, a martyr, or what? Trip, what do you think?
Sam, I actually think this is the most significant week we've seen politically since January 6th. You know, the invasion of the Capitol by a mob of Trump supporters. There were a few days in the aftermath where Republican elected officials seemed to be backing away from Donald Trump. We've now seen, this week with the ouster by Republicans of Liz Cheney from a leadership position in the Republican caucus, as well as a couple of things you mentioned earlier, this absurdist audit in Arizona by partisan Republican officials, and then the wave of state laws in Republican-led states, cracking down, making it harder to vote. This is a culmination of elected Republicans rallying around Trump's lies that the 2020 election was stolen, and tethering themselves to Trump's position as a matter of survival, because of, we've seen the polls that show most base Republican voters believe that Joe Biden did not legitimately win. It's a difficult position for Republicans to climb down for. It will perhaps be the major issue going forward in terms of elections this year in a couple of states and next year in the midterms. The party has have reached a kind of point of no return on this with the defenestration of Liz Cheney.
Matt, it seems like Liz Cheney is sort of an unlikely heroine. How did she get to be in this position? And why, out of the entire Senate Republican caucus, is she all by herself?
Well, in the House, she was not alone in condemning Trump's lies on the election out of the House Republican side. Adam Kinzinger, as we have discussed before, was another member who, among some others, opposed what Trump was doing. I think, the stated reason for her ouster was that she was, among other things, focusing on the past and getting in the way of Republican unity. I think it's very clear from the former president's comments since the election that he is quite focused on the past and on the election that he lost and on perpetuating these lies about that election. So I think in Liz Cheney's case, there is, in her mind, a sort of moment of no return here, as Trip referenced. There is no coming back, lying at the election and the democratic process. As a Republican, I think, despite her, ideological conservatism, despite her support for a lot of the policies of the Trump administration, this was a moment where compromise of any sort on that principle of free and fair elections was not seen as an option for her.
Trip, Kevin McCarthy of California, the minority leader, says each day spent relitigating the past is one day less we have to seize the future. But isn't this going to make us relitigate the past even more? If we talk about rerunning the election of 2020, if we talk about that election having been stolen, aren't we wallowing in the past instead of looking forward to the future?
That's absolutely right, and particularly for Republicans. This week, McCarthy and Mitch McConnell, the Republican leaders in Congress, are actually meeting with Biden at the White House to talk about the administration's proposals on infrastructure and perhaps even the voting rights proposals, which is a future-focused agenda. That news is going to be overshadowed this week by the Cheney ouster. This is the legacy of Donald Trump. His voters and the elected officials who are beholden to his voters are placing their chips in a dangerous gamble that democracy is not to be trusted unless it confirms Republican power. I mean, that's what we're seeing in Arizona. That's what we're seeing in some of the other states. That's certainly what we're seeing in Congress. I mean, the Trump legacy is that Democrats who win office, through elections are not legitimate.
Matt, why is the party so tethered to Trump? A lot of people sort of felt once he lost the election, at least by most counts, the party would sort of be rid of him. The party would be free to go in whatever direction it wanted to. Why do some Republicans, or most Republicans, feel that as a matter of survival, they have to stick with Trump at this point?
Well, look, he may have lost the election. He may have never been a particularly popular president when he was in office nationally, but in these districts where Republicans serve, if you're a House Republican, there's a very good chance that he is wildly popular in your district, and that a primary challenge is the likeliest path for you to not get reelection if you're in one of these very lopsided, very gerrymandered congressional districts. So by and large, the voters of these representatives in Congress are huge Trump fans and might well believe just about anything he's saying about the election. So there is this sort of issue of having a shared voter base that believes Trump on this, and running afoul of that, as we saw in a very conservative place like Liz Cheney's district, can create a sort of backlash that is not worth the trouble in the minds of some Republicans.
Trip, we've seen instances before in American politics of, I guess, what you could call graciousness. Nixon, I'm sure, thought he won the election, but didn't contest it after a point. So did Al Gore. So what is this about in the case of Trump? Does he really think that he won the election, or is this all tactical, strategic, an attempt to rerun that election in 4 years?
Sam, you and I are both lifelong New Yorkers. We've been exposed to Donald Trump for decades, more than most Americans, I suppose. If I knew what was going on in his mind, I'd be the most successful political journalist in America. Whether he believes it or not, yes, I'm gonna guess that he probably does believe it. At least he believes it in the moment he says it. There was a very pathetic tape that emerged on social media, I guess a week or two ago. He was addressing what was some small gathering at Mar-a-Lago, his club in Florida, talking about how the election was stolen and to keep your eyes on Arizona and Michigan and New Hampshire, that they would find all kinds of votes. I mean, there is a belief, in the fever swamps of the Republican Party that Trump will return to office somehow, and he's certainly stoking, all these conspiracy theories about a stolen election. And yeah, I guess at the bottom, I probably would have to say he does believe it.
Matt, in terms of Congress, in terms of the votes in Congress, does this make any difference, at least in the short term? Republicans in the Senate were voting against President Biden anyway. Does this in any more solidify that vote? Does it change anything? or is the legislation that the president is proposing still have rough going in the Senate, and all depends on the Democrats staying together?
Yeah, it doesn't change the math of any legislation. I do think there is a case to be made that this conversation sort of extending out of the Capitol riots in January does make the atmosphere all that more toxic. We have seen some bipartisan bills from past cycles come into conflict because a Democratic sponsor doesn't want to associate with somebody who voted to overturn election results in some of these states. There is certainly this overarching toxicity that has permeated the place, which was already quite toxic over these last several months. And the Liz Cheney ouster can't help that environment. But as a matter of the legislative math, that hasn't changed.
Trip, we're talking before the president met with congressional leaders of both parties. Is the fact that he's meeting at all, and this is the first such meeting at the White House since the fall of 2019, I think, is that in itself a good sign that at least they're sitting down and talking to each other?
Yeah, it is on the surface a good sign. I suspect it'll be one of the shortest meetings, in the White House, in the Biden administration to date. McConnell said the other day that he is 100% focused on stopping the Biden agenda. That reminds a lot of people of his reaction in the first year of the Obama administration. Republicans are upset, with President Biden, who they say, ran on as a candidate who would reach across the aisle and form consensus deals with his opponents. And they feel that, the three major bills that he's put forward on pandemic relief and the two infrastructure proposals are far out of whack with anything that Republicans can agree on, that they are, channeling a very progressive agenda, and that this is not the Biden that they thought they'd be working with. So I think the odds for, the short term are not particularly hopeful.
Trip, are the Republicans offering any sort of alternative?
They are. I mean, the numbers, kind of get confusing, but roughly if the White House and Democrats propose a $2 billion, American Families Plan or a $2.3 million American Jobs Plan, the Republicans come back with 25% of that, $800,000 in infrastructure spending, and a very sort of narrow infrastructure bill that's just about roads and bridges and not about housing retrofits and redeveloping the electric grid to support green energy or renewable energy. So and specifically what the Republicans don't want to embrace, which the White House does, is any kind of tax increases either on wealthy Americans or on corporations.
Matt, a quick question on Governor Cuomo. You wrote in the Times Magazine that the governor was going to keep governing, hope the crisis he faced would go away, let time heal. That seems to be exactly what he's trying to do. Is it going to work?
Not much has changed these last several weeks. I think the big question remains what will be in these reports, particularly from the Attorney General's office, around allegations of sexual misconduct on the governor's part. He has kept his head down. He is holding events with reporters again. He is showing up to demonstrate that the state is coming back strong. He wants to be seen as this sort of guiding light of the pandemic recovery, in the same way that he was seen, at least nationally, initially as this sort of heroic figure early in the pandemic. So I do think that's been his approach, and that's sort of the only hand he has right now.
Thank you, Trip Gabriel, Matt Flegenheimer of the New York Times. And coming up next, big business and the GOP at war. Big business and Republicans usually have a cozy relationship. Corporations donate money to GOP candidates, political action committees. They're rewarded with tax cuts, tax breaks, and less regulation. But the two sides are now at war over the issue of voting restrictions. Two high-profile Black executives, former American Express CEO Ken Chenault and Merck CEO Ken Frazier, called on business leaders to speak out against Georgia's voter suppression laws. Two Atlanta-based companies, Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines, did speak out, and they were hit with a backlash from state Republicans, including threats of removing tax breaks. Major League Baseball pulled the All-Star game from Georgia. Hundreds of top executives signed a statement opposing the restrictions as more states move to limit voting rights. The Times reports that executives are getting pressure from both sides, quote, Democratic activists, along with many mainstream business leaders, are calling on corporations to oppose the new laws. At the same time, a growing chorus of senior Republicans is telling corporate America to keep quiet. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell warned business to, quote, stay out of politics. So what's next in this showdown? Will corporations stop donating to Republicans? Will they pull business investments from states that enact voter restrictions? We're joined by David Gellis, business correspondent for The Times, who writes the Corner Office column. David, what's going on here? Why is big business picking this issue to take a stand on? It was very interesting that they took a stand on something like Black Lives Matter, something that was arguably more theoretical, something that nobody could really be against. It was something ideological. But here they're taking a stand on something that is very dear to Republicans, something where Republicans think their seats are actually at stake in the next election. Why is corporate America speaking out on this?
Well, Sam, it's not just this issue. For years now, we've seen companies get more and more involved in social and political debates. This is, of course, has been going on since the 1980s, when companies stood up to apartheid South Africa and pulled their businesses out of there. And we saw it again in the 90s when certain corporations, Apple and IBM, began extending marital benefits to same-sex couples. So business has always been having to deal with whatever the big issues of the day are. But in the last 5 years, this has taken on a new urgency. Under President Trump, companies found themselves having to address everything from his immigration policies to his statements that appeared to be sympathetic to white supremacy, to his withdrawal from the Paris Climate Treaty and the country's walk back from its earlier pledges to combat climate change. This really is the extension of that. Many CEOs I know had hoped that the temperature would get turned down in a Biden administration, that they wouldn't be getting drawn into politics. But this issue really has just perpetuated this dynamic and really become even perhaps the most explosive instance of when companies are having to take a stand on social and political issues. And they are frankly in a no-win situation.
I don't want to be cynical about this, although, I guess we're sort of trained to be, but do the companies really believe this, or is this out of self-interest because they think their shareholders or customers or clients believe this?
Many of the CEOs I talk to really do believe that some of these laws will make it harder for some people, especially Black voters, to access the ballot boxes. And that's something they truly care about. Just because they're the CEO of a major corporation doesn't mean that they leave all their other morals at the door. Maybe some of them, but not all of them. And so a lot of these people are Americans who care deeply about the right for people to vote. And so some of them absolutely are taking a principled stand. It's also the case, however, that many of their employees, many of their customers, many of their partners, and activists, including people like Stacey Abrams, are making a real push to get corporations to take a stand on this issue. So they are feeling pressure both perhaps from their own conscience, but also from all sorts of stakeholders and constituents. And they have to weigh their own views, the views of the employees, partners, activists, against the cost of doing nothing, which in this case, they believe is potentially allowing our country to go one step closer to something that doesn't resemble so much a representative democracy. And that's really a concern for them.
David, we've seen statements by these companies. We've seen newspaper ads. We've seen some actions like Major League Baseball. What else can the corporations actually do affirmatively to pressure politicians, to pressure Congress?
Well, there's a big gap between what they could do and so far what they are doing. In the wake of January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, many companies said that they would stop contributing money to any lawmaker that did not certify the Electoral College results. Most companies so far have more or less held to those pledges. But what we haven't seen is companies take that same kind of stance when it comes to lawmakers who are putting forward laws that they believe amount to what, in the words of some CEOs, is equivalent to voter suppression. We also haven't seen any major corporation really take business out of some of the states that are passing these laws. And that's because, guess what? These laws are being advanced in almost every state in the country. So you can't take your business out of every state. And listen, big businesses are not going to up and move their headquarters from Atlanta, Georgia. They're not going to suddenly turn on a dime and walk back that $100 million investment that they just made in Austin, Texas. So as Republicans in major big economy states advance these laws, it's getting harder and harder for companies to figure out where exactly they do have any leverage.
Well, didn't they have leverage when they were supporting the Republicans, when they were supporting tax cuts, when they were supporting other things that were favorable to business? Why did they have the leverage then and don't seem to have it now?
Yeah, well, some of the CEOs would argue that the Republican Party has really changed in front of their eyes over the last several years. And this is getting to what we believe is an enormous story, which is this broader schism I've been writing about over the last several months between the GOP and corporate America. For a long time, as you said earlier, these were allies, right? There was sort of no two constituencies that had a longer, healthy, productive working relationship when it came to advancing one another's interests. That is starting to fray in a pretty fundamental way. And it's not as simple as corporations are suddenly going to cozy up to the Democratic Party. Democrats are still pursuing an aggressive antitrust agenda. They are intent on raising corporate taxes. And there are still major points of disagreement with them on all sorts of policies. However, it is the case that on this issue of voting rights, the Democrats and many CEOs seem quite aligned. And so there are new opportunities for them to work together.
David, we've seen the corporate executives who have come out for voting rights, for or against voter suppression. What about the ones who have abstained in these petitions? The ones who have said, no, we're not signing this. No, we agree with the Republicans. Where are they?
Well, few.
And who are they?
Yeah, few corporations have actually proactively said that they support these laws. Instead, what you find are many companies, and let's be honest, there are many companies that have either not taken a stand or taken very mild stands on these issues. And they are essentially trying to stay out of the news, Sam. You know, the companies that get drawn right into the thick of this, such as Delta Airlines and Coca-Cola, they wind up spending an enormous amount of time, an enormous amount of their CEOs' times having to deal with the fallout from these instances. So you look at the counterpoint, which in the case of Georgia would be other major Atlanta area companies, UPS and Home Depot. Protesters were asking them to take a stand. They were getting calls from their employees, from their stakeholders too, saying, we need you to come out and oppose these laws. Instead, what they did was made blanket statements that say, we support voting rights for everyone. And that was the end of it for them. At the end of the day, I would argue that those companies came out of this ordeal with certainly a lower cost to their reputation. And yet they are, in a small way, sort of vilified by the voting rights community for not taking a stand. So each company is having to make these complex calculations one state at a time. And what's going to be so fascinating going forward is how this dynamic plays out in Texas, as it is right now, but in all these other states, including Florida around the corner, Arizona coming right up, and across the country in the months ahead.
So very, very quickly, the real pressure is going to be where the states have their headquarters, where the companies have their headquarters, and as each state considers the legislation about voting suppression or voting rights, whatever we want to call it. Our thanks to David Gellis of the New York Times for joining us. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.